thank you very much, Professor Lopez, for your kind words of introduction. And thanks also for the wonderful summary of my main ideas, which I put forward over the past years. It's always good to hear it from someone else so that I can learn more and better what the arguments really are, right? I also want to thank you for chairing today's session. Special thanks, of course, also go to the team at the Immigration Observatory for hosting me and giving me a chance to share my thoughts with you. And it's indeed an honor and a pleasure to talk with you today about the transnationalized social question. Let me just try to share my screen. And I hope you can all see it. So today's topic, as Professor Lopez mentioned, is the transnationalized social question, migration and the politics of inequalities. Now, to start with an observation, in the 19th century, as Professor Lopez already mentioned, the social question, namely the conflict between capital and labor, the gross class and wealth and income and living inequalities, they really were put in a nutshell by Marx and Engels in their Communist Manifesto. And they really, the famous first line reads, "The specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter." And so what Marx and Engels did was really to focus on the voice, on the political activities of those who wanted to change this situation to address the social question. Now, when we move fast forward 150 years, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, a literary scholar and a political philosopher, in the year 2000, they also talk about a specter. But the specter they are talking about is the specter of migration, saying a specter haunts the world, and it is the specter of migration. Now, it almost seems as if Hart and Negri have replaced the working class with migrants as the subject class or the subject group which will bring about change. Is that so? Well, when we turn to economists like Branko Milanovic, who used to work for the World Bank, this looks very different. He wouldn't say so. Instead, his argument is, well, nowadays, it's not voice really that is at the core of dealing with the social question, but it's exit, it's migration. And why does he think so? Well, he compares global income inequalities. He compares individual income across the world in the year 1870 and the year 2000. Needless to say, these are gross estimates. And a heroic feat to really use this data. So we shouldn't take it at face value, but still the data shows some trends. What he says for the year 1870 is that about 50% of the income position of any individual around the world was explained by class, or could be explained by its class, his or her class position, whether or not in very simple terms, he or she was a capitalist or a worker. In a very Marxian sense, it's kind of a Marx world, so to speak. And only about 10 to 20% of income inequality, of the income of any individual, could be explained by location, the country he or she lived in, or you could say citizenship. Now, in the year 2000, this has been reversed, or this was reversed. In the year 2000, location accounts for about 50% of income inequality and only about 20% or 25% by class. Now, that is a complete reversal and suggests, well, voice would not be really the main response to the social question, to the gross inequalities in living conditions, but exit. So it's not in Hirschman's terms, who use these concepts, exit and voice, in a very systematic way. We could say that exit has replaced voice. So it's a totally different kind of world we live in, according to Milanovic, from the world Marx and Engels envisaged, or even neo-Marxists such as Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. Now, has indeed, that's the question, has exit really indeed trumped voice as a response to the social question? And if that's been the case, if that was the case, if we think about it, then we would move to different issues. We would move from exploitation of workers to exclusion of migrants. We would move from class as a main dominant trench line to status and cultural differences. Think about all the politics around recognition and identity in Europe. And we would move from redistribution of income and wealth to recognition, to recognize living styles, to recognize cultural practices, to recognize religious difference, for example. But once we start thinking about it, we may get doubts, or at least I got doubts, that exit has really replaced voice totally or dominantly. Namely, when we look at a lot of refugees from war-torn countries, we realize that exit may enable voice, that once people leave a country, they may be able to form in a diaspora and to agitate or to be active for reforms in their country, for transformation of their country of origin. So what I want to ask today and talk about today more systematically now is what are the implications of exit for voice if it's not a zero-sum game? And what are the political cleavages we see when we look at exit and voice? Now, as I already mentioned, the old social question was between capital and labor, and Professor Lopez already mentioned was really congealed in the notion of class. And the social question really referred to the unsustainable inequalities during capitalist industrialization in the 19th century, was really characterized by class conflict, pure and simple. Although there were many other conflicts, but the social question congealed around class. Now, I'm looking at today's world, and what I see is a transnationalized social question, namely that we are not only dealing with conflicts between capital and labor, although these conflicts still continue, but the social question is also, and this is suggested by Milanovic, has a locational issue. There's a spatial dimension to the social question. Often nowadays, there is a difference, a dichotomy made between the global South and the global North. And although this is a problematic dichotomy for lots of reasons we can go into in the discussion, it is a first kind of cut at saying, well, migration is an issue where you have a kind of a conflict between global South and global North and global South, or if not conflict, at least lots of differences in living conditions, lots of differences in wealth, income, and status. And the transnationalized social question has a spatial dimension, and it plays on various scales, on local, on national, and supranational, or on global levels. So that's what's meant by the transnationalized social question. But it's interesting to look at the transnationalized social question because migration raises issues not only of class difference, which we talked a lot about when analyzing migration in the 60s and 70s, migrants as part of the proletariat. But nowadays, we also talk about gender differences, religious recognition and differences, ethnic, racism, you name it. There are manifold heterogeneities or differences. Now, before I go into the characteristics of the politics of exit and voice in today's world, I would like to simply spend a minute or two on the differences between the old social question of the 19th century and the transnationalized social question of the 21st century. And to my mind, there are four differences. And one of them, the fourth one, has already been mentioned by Professor Lopez in his introductory words. The first difference is that in the late 19th century, we did not have fully fledged welfare states in the global North. And we did not have really what we nowadays call development or what used to be called development or developmental states in the global south. And with the advent, especially of the welfare state, that has had implications for migration and migration control, because the welfare state tries to create as much equality as possible for its citizens inside the borders, but really exerts social closure, in the words of Max Weber, exclusion, we could say, towards those outside. And often the reason is given is that if borders were totally open, the institutions of the welfare state would crumble because, for example, employer associations would not negotiate with unions anymore because they have lots of docile and cheap labor. Now, whether or not that's the case, that's another matter, but that would be an argument. And something similar could be said about the development state in what could be called the global south, namely, and their functional equivalents, both of them really hold the promise of better living conditions for its citizens. And the development state, of course, has welfare state elements. So it's not to say that the development state is devoid of welfare, but the development state is, so to speak, geared towards economic growth, catching up. And in that kind of effort, what also is something that we didn't have in the 19th century, when these states were still mostly subjected to European imperialism and colonialism, what you didn't have is really the effort to catch up economically. And in this case, in this way, the danger of losing educated, highly skilled labor, namely the famous brain drain. So this was not the case in the 19th century. Second, and I'm moving a bit quicker now, nowadays we have much more effective migration control. Think of externalization of migration policies. The borders of Europe are not in the Mediterranean necessarily only, or they are not at the Danish or German or Spanish or Portuguese border. They are often inside Africa, for example, where the Spanish Guardia Civil is cooperating with the Senegalese border guards to prevent migrants from taking off and sailing to the Canary Islands, for example. So this is a kind of a remote control. Entry controls have become more sophisticated. So that's another big difference between the 19th and the 21st century. Third, and this is especially important to what I'm going to say, is the increasing culturalization of politics. Now, this is not only something we find in migration. We found it already, the increasing culturalization of politics, the increasing really getting away from class as a main or only dividing line in the new social movements of the 1970s. There, if you think about the kind of the gay movement, if you think about feminist movements, which of course were already there in the 19th century, but with renewed vigor in the 1960s and 70s, you find that it's not only issues of redistribution, but also issues of recognition which emerge. And migration ties in, so to speak, into this seminal development, which I think makes all the difference. And in migration, you find it in the consequences of migration, the debate on multiculturalism. Although people like Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron Sarkozy, I think it was, his predecessor, declared multiculturalism dead. It's not dead, it's well and alive, and the discussions go on. And the fourth point mentioned by Professor Lopez is that we do not have a dominant theory like socialist or anarchist theory under which movements sail, so to speak, but we have a plurality of theories, a plurality not only of socialist or anarchist or feminist theories, but also of ecological theories, of many, many movements which are represented, for example, at the gatherings of the regional or at the World Social Forum. So when I talk about the 21st century and the transnationalized social question, these differences should be kept in mind. And I think it's very important to really point out that there has been no replacement of class, and I will suggest as much in the following, but a complementation of class, so to speak. Now, before I go into puzzles, the puzzles themselves, the politics of exit and voice, I want to point towards transnationalized puzzles. What is a transnationalized puzzle? Well, the live worlds, as we see when we look at migration and migrants across the world, is often cross-border. Not every migrant, but a lot of migrants maintain ties across borders back to the country of origin or to relatives in other countries of destination. So they live sometimes in the country of destination, but embedded in transnational social spaces. But, and this is important, political decision-making along migration is still in national states. It's located in national states. And this is a transnational puzzle. The social question is a transnational puzzle. And I would like to talk now about the puzzles and not presenting a theory that would be much too demanding to what I can do, but to really suggest a heuristic device in order to tackle the problems of exit and voice. And I will divide my considerations into immigration puzzles and emigration puzzles, although most of the states in the world are both immigration and emigration states. So this is more an analytical distinction and not a real world distinction. Now to the immigration puzzles. I'm using here 2x2 tables, really the most important, I think, tool of any social scientist, right? The 2x2 table here is very simple in a way. On the horizontal, you have immigration policies. Are these immigration policies expansive, meaning open borders, so to speak, or relatively open borders? Or are they restrictive, meaning relatively closed borders? As simple as that, as crude as that. And very crude again, on the vertical, you see, are migrants economically wanted? And are they culturally welcome? So I simply distinguished in the realm of economics and culture. Again, ideal typical distinction, not a real world one. And what you have in the economic realm is what I would call a welfare puzzle. What is the welfare puzzle? The welfare puzzle basically is the following. The borders for goods or borders of nation states are mostly open for goods, sometimes even for services, but they're mostly closed and they're not as open for labor. Why is that so? You have, on the one hand, you have the process of market liberalization, where labor and migrants also are regarded here as labor, are regarded as human capital. And this is the hallmark of the state as a competition state. So be as liberal as could be, so to speak. And this is opposed to the welfare state principle. The competition state is opposed to the welfare state. And the welfare state is about regulated commodification. It regulates working conditions. And it's also about decommodification, namely enabling people even sometimes to have a basic or at least a modicum of income, irrespective of their market participation. And the welfare state is all about protection. It's protecting its citizens. It's protecting also settled migrants. And it is about rights, the social rights of citizens and settled people. Now, this is in conflict. Why is this in conflict? Because the competition state calls for open borders, whereas the welfare state, in order to protect its citizens from competition around jobs, around housing, that's the welfare state. Now, the competition in the welfare state to be avoided is not the competition for jobs. I mean, that's, I think, too simplistic. The competition is if there is something else, or it's not competition. It is really the fact that what I mentioned before, that the institutions of the welfare state only work satisfactorily in the national context if they are guarded from outside, so to speak, intervention. Intervention, for example, in the fact that employer associations, if there are many migrants, don't negotiate with unions anymore, so that the institutions, the regulation of the welfare state would be endangered. So that's the welfare puzzle. You could also say a welfare dilemma, or if you're philosophically inclined, the welfare paradox. These two principles don't go together very neatly. Another, and that's kind of a classical juxtaposition, a classical puzzle. The other puzzle, I think, is a typical 21st century puzzle, namely the liberal puzzle. It's been called like that by political scientists for quite a while. And basically it says that states decide in a sovereign way who they admit and who they exclude. But once people are on the territory, there are certain human rights, liberal democracies at least, should concede or should observe. Whether or not that's done, that's another matter. So here you have a tension, in a dilemma between the rule of law on the one hand and the national state on the other hand, the national state which is sovereign to decide. The rule of law furthers a process called cultural pluralism and is deeply rooted in the rights revolution, which became very obvious in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, but also in the ever-growing importance of human rights in international conventions, also with the International Labor Organization since the late 1970s. And human rights also pertain not only to labor migrants, but also to a category, people categorized as refugees, to observe their human rights, to be sheltered from prosecution. Now that is kind of the rule of law is really pushing for observation of human rights. Whereas the national state is all about citizen rights, and it's about a cultural issue, and the idea, the process called culturalization, that there is something like a national cultural homogeneity, that our ways of life need to be protected. And this sometimes leads to securitization, namely that migrants are regarded as risks and threats. Just think of the argument after 2015 that among those refugees from the Middle East, especially from Syria and Iraq, there could be terrorists. But securitization goes much further than that, and is about something I mentioned before, in that in order to guard this way of life, migration control needs to be, or is supposed to be, stricter than ever. Not only Frontex in the Mediterranean, but kind of remote control in Mali or Niger or Chad. So here you have a liberal puzzle. And my argument would be that the welfare puzzle and the liberal puzzle really contribute to a politicization of migration around inequalities. And the economic and the cultural realm play together. You can see how they play together when you look at issues of social integration of migrants. Their class plays a role, but also culture. When you look at a category which is often called highly qualified migrants, which is not the fact that only they are highly qualified and that they are unqualified or non-qualified, but they're categorized as highly qualified, right? When you look at those categories, there is rarely talk about their issues of social integration. There is silence on that. So what's talked about when social integration is mentioned, both academically, but especially in public debates, is those migrants who are considered traditional or backward or illiberal. and religious. So the whole debate not the whole debate, but some of the debate around Muslim migrants really goes in that direction. So the welfare puzzle and the liberal puzzle in a way are interacting, and class is, so to speak, predisposing already what cultural issues come up. Not in a deterministic way, but there is a link between the two. And there has been a kind of a progression in my home country, in Germany, for example. Class was the dominant way to describe migrants in the 1960s and 70s. So migrants were considered members of a working class. And true enough, migrants were at the forefront of strikes, for example, at the Ford plants in Cologne in the 1970s. In the late 70s and 80s, migrants were mostly talked about and conceived as ethnics, as nationals. So they were considered Turks or Italians. And since the end of the Cold War and since the early 1990s, migrants are mostly talked about in religious terms as Muslims or sometimes Christians, but Muslims has the most negative connotation. So there has been, so to speak, a kind of a progression of heterogeneities, which includes class, but goes beyond it, but is nevertheless never oblivious of class. When we now move on to the emigration side of it, we face, of course, two immigration puzzles. And here, instead of immigration policies, of course, we have emigration policies. And there I distinguish between a broad kind of conception of nation or nationhood. The nation is a global nation with our migrants abroad. That would be one kind of notion. And the other one is the nation at home, which focuses on the country of origin. And the development puzzle is very similar. It's in the economic realm. It's the kind of tension between the competition state and not the welfare state here, but I call it the development state, although it has quite a few welfare elements. Of course, we can talk about that. And here, what you have is that from a market liberal point of view, from the competition states, immigrants really are great, a great idea because they go abroad and send back financial remittances. And we all know that financial remittances are now much more important as a source of development aid, or not aid, finance, so to speak, than official development aid. So, but from the point of view of a narrower point of view of the development state, economic development is based on national human resources, not only physical resources, but also human resources. And that's why a brain drain has to be avoided. It's very costly. And mind you, brain drain is a real issue. If you look at, let's say, at the migration of medical doctors to Canada from the US, to the US from South Africa, and to South Africa from Malawi, you can tell that US is able to replace its doctors with those from South Africa. I'm overdoing it a bit. South Africa with those from Malawi, but those in Malawi cannot be replaced because there is an end of this brain cascade. There are countries not able to replace the brain drain, and there's always a last country which cannot do that. Now, there's a tension, so to speak, here between market liberalization towards the global economy and national development as processes, and that's really the distinction between the competition state and the development state. We also have, like in the immigration side, a cultural puzzle. And the cultural puzzle has a lot to do with what's called diaspora. Because from the transnational point of view, from the transnational state, emigration and all the diasporas are assets. Are assets economically, are assets even in terms of perhaps cultural diplomacy. And emigration countries such as Turkey, which is at the same time an important immigration country, do the same as like Germany does, namely founding institutes abroad, the Yunus Emre Institute, which is kind of the equivalent to the Goethe Institute, right? So there's also cultural diplomacy made through that. But this transnational, the idea of a transnational state quickly reaches its limits when diasporas really engage in political reform or try to engage politically against the regime in the country of origin. Then they're regarded usually as a threat. Think of the Tamil Tigers in the case of Sri Lanka up until recently, or Sikhs in India, especially in the 40s and 50s, or Kurds from Iran, Syria, Iraq, Turkey in Europe. So if that's the case, then securitization of a different nature from the immigration countries, but nonetheless securitization sets in. And this is the hallmark of the national state or the national security state. So again, we have a tension in the cultural realm between the transnational state and the national security state. Now, I grant that these are very crude distinctions, but I think these puzzles on the immigration side, namely the welfare puzzle and the liberal puzzle, and on the emigration side, the development puzzle and the national puzzle, describe tensions at the very least. And I think it's important to really think through what I just said. It seems to me, and this has to be bolstered, of course, by much more empirical reference and empirical evidence that I'm able to muster here right now, in that certainly cultural issues have not replaced class necessarily. Neither with regard to general politics with the no social movements, nor to migrant claims making. But culture has gained a much more prominent issue and is interacting with class. What I said before, that class is one of the determinants of whether or not social migrants are talked about as a problem of social integration. But what's even more interesting, I think, is that, for example, when we turn back to immigration politics, there are strange bedfellows, we could call them, or Aristide Solberg, late US American political scientist, called them strange bedfellows. And let me just go back to the immigration side. Here we have, on the competition state, the main actors are employers. In the rule of law, it is the main actors are social movements and courts. In the welfare state, the main actors are unions, social democratic parties, or social democratic wings of Christian democratic parties, and so on and so forth. And in the national state, it's the cultural conservatives. So here, when it's the politics of immigration is so interesting and so bedeviled sometimes, my suggestion is that it's because of the strange bedfellows, because those who push for more open borders are employers and cultural activists or multiculturalists. And these are not natural coalition partners, to say the least. They go together somehow, but there are lots of tensions. The same is true for those who are pushing for more restrictive borders. Namely, in the welfare state, let's say unions on the one hand and social democratic parties, and cultural conservatives, or even right-wing populists on the other hand, who push for the national state. They're also usually not coalition partners in other parts of politics or in other realms of politics. So that's why I'm speaking here of strange bedfellows, that employers and cultural pluralists are really for open borders, whereas social protectionists and cultural conservatives or right-wing populists push for closed borders. So my suggestion is that the dynamics of these politics is really one which is very fractured. Now, what are the consequences? And let me just, of this politics of exit, the politics of migration for voice. What I have not, before I go into it, let me say that what I have not talked about so far is really the fact that, of course, it's not only actors I just mentioned, such as employers or unions or multiculturalists or cultural conservatives are actors, but also migrants themselves. And going back just a moment, you could say that migrants usually take a while until they are conceived and conceive themselves as sociocultural and sociopolitical actors. And they play a huge role, not only in the welfare puzzle, I think, but also a very important role in the liberal puzzle, because they are the ones who, and not only multiculturalists, of course, who push, let's say, for religious recognition, who push for the recognition of their human rights. So it's not only the advocates, of course, of migrants, but migrants themselves who are very important actors in this equation. And there have been developments, of course, which have always been changing then the role of migrants as actors, because multiculturalism, with its emphasis on social rights, and there have been quite a few migrant organizations, of course, and still are very active in this realm. But also we have moved, so to speak, in the politics, in the semantics of the politics of difference, to diversity as a kind of a paradigm. And diversity is not only about rights, it's less about rights, it's usually more about resources. And migrants, again, you can see, especially in a country like Germany, that migrant organizations adapt to this changing environment and really then advocate the resources migrants have for the country of destination, so to speak. Now, but let me go back to some of the main consequences of the politics of exit and voice. Namely, distinguishing again ideotypically between immigration in the North and in the South. And here it seems to me that when you look at it from the immigration perspective, from the immigration side, not from the migrant side, it's kind of a reloading of Max Weber's Protestant ethic. We all know that Weber argued that Calvinist Protestants believed that they could find out whether or not they were chosen by the fruits of their labor. So God rewards them with the fruits of their labor. Well, here you could say that those who perform well economically and espouse liberal attitudes, they're the ones to be rewarded, but not in afterlife, but in this life, right? Whereas the low and non-performers in the market, the traditionalists, those who are supposedly backwards and non-democratic, are excluded. And again, this is not only a cultural issue, but also a class issue. There is lots of talk and distinctions made between high-skilled and low-skilled, as if these really truly reflected the skills, as if it's not just a categorization, of course, or the distinction between liberal and traditional. Now, when it comes to the emigration sites in the so-called global South, one of the main effects is what could be called the Matthew effect of accumulated advantage, like Robert Merton termed it. It means that those who migrate, and especially the advantaged among the migrants and their kin, they gain most. Meaning that those who migrate early, those who migrate with considerable resources, although those who are able to reinvest remittances in the country of origin. So it means not necessarily, migration may mean, and this is very important, that remittances could really address issues of poverty sometimes a bit. They could really make life easier for some families when it comes to paying for schools of the children or paying for the health care of the family. But it does not, and in terms of transformation. It does not transform the systems of inequalities, neither, of course, in the global north, nor in the global south. It really more or less consolidates. But there is, of course, again, a tension, because remittances do have an ameliorating effect on poverty in certain situations. In other situations, however, or on the other hand, they really contribute to entrenched inequalities. Now, let me come to the conclusion in order to have time for discussion. And these are meant in the spirit of nullius in verba, which is the motto of the Royal Academy with a seat in London since the 17th century. And really means nobody's, if you don't translate literally, but in the spirit, in the meaning, nobody's word is final. And this definitely is not the final word. And here, I think it is important when we talk about exit and voice. I have talked a lot about borders, state borders, and I've talked a lot about boundaries between groups, boundaries which mark differences along class lines, ethnic lines, gender lines, religious lines, could be also age lines, many lines we could imagine, and which result in securitization and culturalization. And I do think that it's necessary to really move beyond our conventional thinking of borders. And one way that helps me to start thinking is Georg Simmel's notion of human beings, and I would apply this to migrants as well, as border figures, as Grenzwesen, as people bordering at the border, so to speak. And Simmel, in a very nice way, paradoxically says, borders connect what is separated. And you could say that borders connect in a way that, for example, transnational social spaces between countries of origin and countries of destination connect families, connect communities, for example. But borders not only connect what is separated, but they also separate what is connected, namely by migration control. And so I think that there is a dual face of the border. There is a kind of a border paradox that borders connect and they separate. But when borders connect and separate, of course, what migration control or border control nowadays would go much too far. Like say 30 years ago, only about a dozen states used walls and fences on a large scale to cordon off unwelcome mobility. Nowadays, it's 70, 80, 90 states who are doing that. And these are, in Simmel's understanding, not really borders, because their borders are defined by cross-traffic. So in a way, borders only function, borders can only separate and connect, borders can only function when migration control is definitely not too restrictive. The idea of fences and borders is the very opposite of a border. And this, I think, the idea of borders which connect what's separated and separate what's connected is an old idea, which not only goes back to Georg Simmel, who lived in the age of nationalism, but also goes back to the 17th and 18th century, before the advent of the age of nationalism. And borders, we could say, and the borders between Europe and African countries, for example, borders allow for the possibility of existence of different entities. Of course, what I'm saying is utopian, because for this to work, you need equal status between those on both sides of the border. We don't have this equal status, needless to say. There are manifold inequalities. We live in the age of the transnationalized social question, not only the age of migration. I realize that, but nonetheless, I think what we as social scientists can do instead of giving simply policy advice, I think what's much more important for us to engage in is to rethink certain notions, to start thinking, you know, what could borders mean and what would migration policies entail? At the very least, when you think about African-European borders, it would be ways, legal ways on both sides of communication, traffic, and migration, even though they're not equals. But the fencing, what we see in Ceuta and Melilla, and the kind of strict border controls are a perversion of borders. And I would say this kind of border control we're seeing today is a perversion of what borders could mean and what borders really mean going beyond walls and fences, which do not live up to the fact that borders connect what is separated and separate what's connected. So thank you very much for your attention.